9/11. Here's what I think happened. Back in the mid-1980s, when US President Ronald Reagan and British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher were cozy, the economy was picking up, the rate of inflation had begun to stabilize, and the electronics technology revolution was beginning, the American and British governments realized that eventually there would come a time when the tech bubble would burst, and the deflation which it was creating in the financial system would cause major problems for the balance of trade. A few years earlier, the US had seen the completion of the construction of the World Trade Center, a gas shortage, and rampant inflation. Conflicts in the Middle East were contributing to those gas shortages, and the Western democracies needed an insurance policy to protect against shortages and deflation all at once. The Iraq-Iran War lasted throughout nearly the entire decade of the 1980s, and the US armed both sides. During this time, the US was also investing in Saudi Arabia and arming the opium-tolerant Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviets, which was associated with Osama bin Laden, whose family had interest in both the oil industry and the opium trade, in addition to being friends with the Saudi royal family. The CIA needed help translating negotiations to fund and arm the Mujahideen against the Soviets, so they brought in Asian languages expert, third-generation CIA asset, and future President of the United States, Barack Obama. With Saddam Hussein about to be removed from power in Iraq, there would be little preventing the Iranians from gaining a foothold in the Mesopotamian region against the Israelis, save for continued occupation of Iraq by the military forces of the US, the UK, and dozens of other countries. So, in mid-2000, after the Hussein removal attempt had failed and the Taliban had splintered off of the Mujahideen, as the Taliban was beginning to crack down on the production of opium, the dot-com bubble was in the midst of bursting, and with a presidential election in which a vice president would have succeeded his two-term incumbent president, thus making his election unlikely, only several months away, the US had to find a way to get the opium and the oil for America while doing something about the overvaluation of the dollar. But what's the cure for inflation? Deflation. How does deflation work? Well, it's the exact opposite of how inflation works. Inflation happens when too much money is put into the system. Deflation happens when not enough money is put into the system, or when money is removed from the system. So how can money be removed from the system? One way is for the Federal Reserve to take money back from the banks. Another way is to make something valuable disappear through theft. Yet another way is to make something valuable disappear through destruction. 9/11 accomplished both of the last two. Have you seen those commercials that advertise gold which was somehow miraculously saved from the World Trade Center only months before the buildings were destroyed? And hey, why is Germany suddenly assisting us in so many of our military operations? And why is such a high ratio of the American military force stationed in Germany? Why does Deutsche Börse of Germany now own more than half of the New York Stock Exchange? Hell, why did German Chancellor Angela Merkel just receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Obama? The answer to all these questions? Because the US was storing $300 billion in German-owned gold in Building 7 of the World Trade Center. Not only that, but on the day before the 9/11 attacks, then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld publicly announced that about $2.3 trillion worth of transactions had become unaccounted for. Having destroyed the section of the Pentagon which contained the computer databases in which records of the missing trillions would have been stored, having planned the controlled demolition of the Twin Towers in a World Trade Center Building 7, which housed offices belonging to government agencies which soon after became consolidated into the Department of Homeland Security, and having had access to important parts of those three buildings in the World Trade Center for the purpose of wiring explosives, our intelligence apparatus likely had access to this gold, removed it, and transferred it to Fort Knox and/or into the hands of those financiers and/or politicians who benefited off the destruction of the buildings, and also managed to neatly destroy information in both the Pentagon and Building 7, which would have constituted evidence of planned demolition as well as of the missing assets. Now Germany is following us around the world and watching us, making sure we recover an equal amount of assets for them through the coercive extraction of foreign countries' natural resources. But the following questions remain. Who actually carried out the attack on the World Trade Center, and what does Israel have to do with all of this? Israel's intelligence agency is called Mossad. From 1998 to 2002, its director was Ephraim Halevi. Halevi dispatched Mossad agents, disguised as Arabs, to meet with Mohammed Atta, who believed they were sent by Osama bin Laden. What this means is that Mossad infiltrated al-Qaeda in order to half agent provocateur them, half help them carry out the 9/11 attacks. In order to physically carry out the attack, Mossad brought in a former officer of the Counterterrorism Intelligence Unit Sayeret Matkal. That officer was American Daniel M. Lewin, who happened to be the billionaire chief technical officer of the internet tech company Akamai Technologies. Lewin would be reported as having been murdered by one of the alleged onboard Muslim hijackers, one of whom was reported as being Atta himself, who were seated near him. The reporting of the cause of Lewin's death was inconsistent. One report claims he was stabbed to death, while another claimed he was shot. Some have even claimed that on at least one of the flights that morning, the hijackers had taken control of the airplane before the flight had even taken off. The whole incident would immediately be construed by former and future Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as good for Israel, and World Trade Center leaseholder Larry Silverstein and WTC occupant Frank Lowy of the Westfield Corporation, both influential Jews with close personal and financial ties to the last several prime ministers of Israel, including Netanyahu, would benefit financially off of something which has not been, and will never be, investigated as a possible case of insurance fraud. Then, America and the British would invade Afghanistan and Iraq, and later, unofficially, Pakistan, in order to flank Iran, the supposed Israeli threat, on both sides, in case a quick invasion of that country ever became necessary, or, as it were, opportune. In the meantime, while awaiting this invasion of Iran, the Western democracies would plunder Iraq's oil and direct it westward to themselves and to Israel, while employing American soldiers to help Afghani tribesmen farm their poppies, to be purchased cheaply for use in opiate narcotic painkillers produced by Western pharmaceutical industries, and exploring Afghanistan's then undiscovered abundant mineral resources. After that, two prominent victim figures would come together in New York City in order to attempt to drum up anti-Iranian sentiment in the U.S., fueling the fire of fears that its president was a Holocaust-denying, Jew-oppressing next Hitler whom had vowed to violently destroy the state of Israel and all its inhabitants. Those victim figures were the mayor of New York City during the so-called attack, Rudy Giuliani, and Elie Wiesel, a man whom has been alleged to have stolen the identity of a Holocaust survivor and author, and thus could be used to exploit the situation to manipulate Americans in general and American Jews in particular into supporting a potential war against Iran. And of course, the facts that Iran possesses no nuclear weapons and has signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that Israel has not, despite possessing 800 nuclear weapons, making it the world's third greatest nuclear military power, would never be mentioned in any mainstream media outlet. Oil, opium, and additional mineral resources secured. Deflation addressed. Rich and powerful made even more so. Germany placated. Israel protected. Case closed.